Hey, this is Dave DeCamp from antiwar.com. This is anti-war news for Tuesday, October 17th, 2023. All right, the first story at the top of antiwar.com today. Yellen says that the U.S. can afford to fund two wars. So Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen insisted on Monday that the U.S. could certainly afford to fund the war in Ukraine and Israel's onslaught in Gaza at the same time as the White House is looking for more military aid for both conflicts. So Yellen's comments came a day after President Biden also said that the U.S. could fund both wars. And Biden said this in an interview with 60 Minutes on Sunday. Kind of a crazy quote here. I'll just read the whole thing for you. Biden said, quote, "We're the United States of America, for God's sakes, the most powerful nation in the history, not in the world, in the history of the world. We can take care of both of these and still maintain our overall international defense." End quote. So that was his response when he was asked, can the U.S. handle, funding both of these conflicts? And Yellen said that the House needs to elect a new speaker so this new funding could be authorized. She said, quote, "We do need to come up with funds both for Israel and for Ukraine. This is a priority. It's really up to the House to seat a speaker and put us in a position where legislation can be passed." End quote. So the White House has also discussed the possibility of rolling funding to arm Taiwan into a potential spending package for Israel and Ukraine. But Yellen did not mention Taiwan, and I've seen Biden administration officials talk about this week. They haven't really been talking about Taiwan. The main focus seems to be Ukraine and Israel, but time will tell if they do request money for Taiwan on top of for Ukraine and Israel. So Yellen said, quote, "America can certainly afford to stand with Israel and to support Israel's military needs, and we can also and must support Ukraine in its struggle against Russia," end quote. So discussing U.S. support for Israel, Yellen said, quote, "We stand with Israel. America has also made clear to Israel we are working very closely with the Israelis that they have the right to defend themselves, but it's important to try to spare innocent civilian lives to the maximum extent possible," end quote. So we've been seeing this from Biden administration officials, them kind of paying lip service to the idea that they want Israel to spare civilian lives. But if you just look at the numbers, what's happening in Gaza, it's clear that that's not the case. And we haven't seen these officials really say anything, condemn, all the airstrikes that have been killing children. So according to the latest numbers in Gaza, at least 2,808 Palestinians have been killed since October 7th, since Hamas launched the attack on southern Israel that killed about 1,300 Israelis. And Israel started really bombing Gaza. So almost 3,000. The number's still rising. The airstrikes continue. And that number includes 853 children and 936 women. So the next one here, Representative Jim Jordan will allow a vote linking Israel and Ukraine aid. So Axios reported on Monday that if Jim Jordan is elected to be the House Speaker, he will likely allow a vote linking military aid for Ukraine and Israel. So this is not good news because Jordan he's voted against the Ukraine spending. He's expressed, skepticism about authorizing new funding for the Ukraine proxy war, but he's a staunch supporter of Israel. So this tactic by the Biden administration to put them two together seems to be working. So right now, Jordan is the nominee to be the House Speaker. Last week, I said, I went over that Steve Scalise was nominated by the GOP to be the House Speaker, but he couldn't get enough support. So then they have since nominated Jordan, and that was on Friday. But they also, after they nominated him, they took another vote that basically asked, if if the House vote happened right now to make him the speaker, how many would support Jordan? And in that vote, he only received support from 152 Republicans, and he needs 217 votes to become the House Speaker. So since Friday, he has been trying to get more Republicans to support him. And based on this Axios report, it sounds like he's telling some Republicans that he will not block a vote for Ukraine aid and Israel aid if it's linked together. So, again, just not a good sign, because there was some hope there before this escalation in Israel and Gaza that if Jordan was elected, it would make it difficult for Biden to keep funding this proxy war. But now that Israel's on the table, and Jordan, again, is a very staunch supporter of Israel, and he has already expressed support for getting more military aid on top of the $3.8 billion that the U.S. gives Israel each year. He wants to provide more. I saw him speak to reporters not that long ago before I started recording this, and he was saying one of his priorities when he gets in is to get more money for Israel. So that's his priority, and it seems like in order to get to that position, he's willing to fold on his support, his opposition to more Ukraine spending. Now, a spokesperson for Jordan did tell Axios that he has not made any promises in his conversations with other lawmakers, but he's only discussing the best way to approach certain issues. But just the way things are going right now, the way kind of there's this hysteria going on in Washington, I wouldn't be surprised if basically as soon as he becomes a House Speaker, we see a vote on some sort of military aid for Ukraine and Israel. And the question is if it will also include Taiwan. I know they want to put border security funding in there to entice the Republicans even more. But yeah, it looks like at some point. Oh, and a vote is expected to happen Tuesday for Jordan to be elected House Speaker. It's not clear if he's going to have enough support. So we'll see how that shakes out. Again, the vote is likely on Tuesday. All right, so the next one here, Israel rejects Zelensky visit. So Israel has rejected Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky's request to visit the country that was made in the wake of the October 7th Hamas attack. And this was reported by the Times of Israel, citing Hebrew language media reports. So again, Zelensky requested to make the trip in a show of solidarity. He has issued statements expressing very strong support for Israel and even compared Hamas to Russia. And it's interesting because his strong support for Israel came after, there's been a lot of tensions between Israel and Ukraine because Israel has refused to provide direct military aid. They've let the U.S. send some weapons that were stockpiled in Israel and things like that. But likely because they don't want to escalate tensions with Russia, which has a military presence in Syria. That's likely the reason why Israel has not decided to ship weapons. But besides that, Zelensky still came out very strongly in support of Israel. And, he requested to make this visit probably because he wants to stay involved. He feels like the world attention isn't really on him anymore, especially in the U.S., now that there's this whole situation in Israel. And we know that he's worried about it because he has said it publicly. Last week, Zelensky expressed concern about the situation in Gaza diverting attention from Ukraine. He said, quote, "Of course, everybody's afraid, and I think also Russia's counting on it on dividing support," end quote. I also saw a quote from Kirilo Budanov, who's the head of Ukraine's military intelligence. He said that if the war in Gaza drags on, quote, "it is quite clear that there will be certain problems with the fact that it will be necessary to supply weapons and ammunition, not only to Ukraine," end quote. And, if Israel's going to need 155 millimeter artillery shells, there is a pretty serious shortage of that kind of munition. So, again, that's something that could certainly be diverted to Israel instead of Ukraine. All right, so the next one here, House Democrats introduce a resolution calling for a Gaza ceasefire. So at least there's some opposition to this full-throated support for Israel. So this was on Monday. A group of progressive Democrats in the House introduced a resolution calling for de-escalation and an immediate ceasefire in Gaza and Israel. So Representative Cori Bush, she was one of the sponsors of this resolution, and she said in a statement, quote, "I am grieving for every Palestinian, Israeli, and American life lost to this violence, and my heart breaks for all those who will forever be traumatized because of it. War and retaliatory violence does not achieve accountability or justice. It only leads to more death and human suffering," end quote. So this effort is being led by Representatives Rashida Tlaib, Andre Carson, Summer Lee, Delia Ramirez. It has also received support from Jamal Bowman, Bonnie Watson-Coleman, Jesus Garcia, Jonathan Jackson, AOC, Ilhan Omar, Ayanna Presley, and Nydia Velasquez. A few of those names I haven't heard of, but you have some members of the squad in there. You know, it's a real shame that you got these progressives that can call for a ceasefire in Gaza that are all really bad on Ukraine, and then kind of vice versa for the Matt Gaetz types Republicans, Jim Jordan, those types of Republicans in the House who are against continued funding for Ukraine, but they're all in on giving more military aid to Israel, and they're not going to call for a ceasefire. So this resolution would urge, quote, "the Biden administration to call for an immediate de-escalation and ceasefire in Israel and occupied Palestine, to send humanitarian aid and assistance to Gaza, and to save as many lives as possible," end quote. So as we know, as I have covered, amid this brutal bombardment of Gaza that's going on, the State Department circulated instructions to its diplomats not to call for a ceasefire or de-escalation of the conflict, and the vast majority of Congress is strongly backing Israel and wants legislation for new military aid. So realistically, we know that if this resolution comes to a vote, it would probably fail pretty miserably. But at least this is a decent-sized group of House Democrats calling for a ceasefire, so at least some people are, thinking more rationally about this situation. You see the people giving them, really criticizing them about this is saying that, they're not calling for the hostages to be released. But if the hostages are your concern, I don't understand how leveling whole city blocks and is going to help the hostages. I mean, it just, I feel like that's an easy way to kill all of them. All right, so the next one here, the U.S. prepares 2,000 troops for a deployment to support Israel. So this is certainly a concerning story. So the Wall Street Journal reported on Monday that the Pentagon has selected 2,000 troops to prepare for a potential deployment to support Israel. Pentagon officials told the paper that the troops would be tasked with missions like advising and medical support and are not intended to serve a combat role. The personnel that have been selected are from across the U.S. Armed Services, and some are already in the Middle East, while others are outside of the region. So the Associated Press also reported that the U.S. is preparing for the potential deployment. One official told AP that they would not be sent to Israel, but could be sent to countries in the region. So it's kind of strange because the Wall Street Journal report made it sound like they would be sent to Israel, and then you have this AP report saying they wouldn't be. And then there's been other reports since kind of just keeping it vague. So it's not clear what circumstances would lead to the deployment, but this notice that these troops got, which is a prepare to deploy notice, this comes as Israel continues to bombard the Gaza Strip. Airstrikes are continuing now, and they are expected to launch a ground incursion, although it does seem like it's been delayed. So Politico reported last week that the U.S. has decided not to send troops into Gaza to rescue hostages, but that report also said the issue could be revisited, and the idea of the U.S. military entering Gaza has not been ruled out. So there's always that risk of escalation here. And while the U.S. has not committed to sending troops into Gaza, they've offered intelligence support for any sort of hostage rescue mission. And of course, they've sent all these military assets to the region, the aircraft carriers and everything. So the U.S. is really getting involved here. All right, so the next one here, Gaza ground invasion delayed due to fears of Hezbollah attack. So the Jerusalem Post reported Monday that Israel has yet to launch a ground invasion of Gaza over fears that Hezbollah could launch a major attack from the north. So an Israeli ground incursion appeared to be imminent on Friday and Saturday after Israel told 1.1 million Palestinians to evacuate North Gaza. But now it's unclear when the invasion will start. The New York Times previously reported that the invasion was delayed due to weather conditions. But sources are telling the Jerusalem Post that Israel was worried Hezbollah could be waiting until the bulk of the Israeli military is committed to the ground invasion in the south to open a second front in the north. So Israel and Hezbollah have exchanged fire on the Israel-Lebanon border, and there have been casualties, and that fire has continued. But this Jerusalem Post report, citing these sources, which are likely Israeli sources, they said that Hezbollah's attacks have been at a fairly low threshold. So they're worried for Hezbollah is a pretty formidable fighting force. So they're worried about more of a serious attack than just firing rockets across the border. So Israel, so the report comes as Iran is warning that the resistance in the region, which refers to Hezbollah and Shia militias operating in Iraq and Syria, might take action if Israel's bombardment of the Gaza Strip does not stop. So Iran's foreign minister issued kind of a new warning on Monday. He said, quote, "The resistance front is capable of waging a long-term war with Israel. In the coming hours, we can expect a preemptive action by the resistance front. If the crimes in Gaza do not stop immediately, new fronts will be opened," end quote. So he's warning not just if Israel invades Gaza, but if they don't stop doing what they're doing, something might happen. So as we've been covering quite a bit, the U.S. has deployed 2 aircraft carrier strike groups to the region, more fighter jets, potentially these troops are going now. And the U.S. officials have made it very clear that they're doing this in the name of deterring, regional actors from entering the war. And they're really referring to Hezbollah there, of course, Iran as well. But Hezbollah is the main, immediate threat to Israel. So what's the implication here? If Hezbollah does really launch a big attack and open, enough that it would be considered a second front in the war, does that mean that the U.S. is going to directly intervene and start bombing Hezbollah, start bombing Lebanon? That seems, reading between the lines, what these U.S. officials are saying, that seems to be the implication. So if that does happen, this thing could really get out of control. So I think that's definitely a risk and something we have to keep an eye on. What authorization does the U.S. have to bomb Hezbollah? That's a good question. But they always find ways to do it. Biden launched airstrikes in Iraq and Syria a few times and claimed the Constitution as his authority to do so, defending U.S. troops, with U.S. troops that happen to be deployed in Iraq and Syria. So, you never know what sort of justification they could find. And I bet if Biden asked for an authorization from Congress, they would probably give it to him, unfortunately. Because they think they could keep this, I bet they think they would be able to keep it limited to just airstrikes. But if that starts happening, all of the U.S. bases in Iraq and Syria are going to come under serious attack from the Shia militias there. So it'll open a front in Syria and Iraq for the U.S. as well. All right, so the next one here, Egypt says that Israel is not cooperating on delivering humanitarian aid to Gaza. So Egyptian officials said Monday that Israel is not cooperating on allowing the delivery of humanitarian aid into Gaza as the enclave is being pushed to the brink due to relentless Israeli airstrikes and a total siege. According to Al Jazeera, Cairo said the Rafah border crossing that connects Gaza and Egypt was closed last week. So Egyptian Foreign Minister Sameh Shoukry also said that Israel was not allowing citizens of other countries to exit Gaza. So despite, so it's not just that they're not allowing the aid in, there's also this push, I think, from the U.S. to allow foreigners that are in Gaza to leave, or maybe Gazans with dual citizenship. So Egypt's foreign minister said, quote, Until now, the Israeli government has not taken a position on opening the Rafah crossing from the Gaza side to allow the entrance of assistance and exit of citizens of third countries, end quote. So Secretary of State Antony Blinken claimed on Sunday that the Rafah border crossing would reopen for aid soon, but the office of Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said on Monday that no deal had been reached. There is currently no ceasefire and humanitarian aid. So this is the quote from Netanyahu's office. They said, quote, "There is currently no ceasefire and humanitarian aid in the Gaza Strip in exchange for the expulsion of foreigners," end quote. So Blinken was back in Israel on Monday, and according to Axios, he told Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu that they have to allow humanitarian aid into Gaza to keep up the support for their war there. Israeli officials have previously said that no humanitarian aid can enter Gaza until Hamas releases the captives that it brought into the enclave. So Israel says that it's turned on water in South Gaza for one community, but Hamas and other authorities in Gaza have denied that any water is flowing, and Gazans are resorting to drinking salty and sewage-contaminated water. So the water is really, really drying up there. It's just a really bad situation for the people on the ground, of course. All right, so the next one here, Hamas seeks Palestinian prisoners' release. So this article is from Reuters, and they quote a Hamas official who lives in exile in Qatar. A top Hamas leader said on Monday that the group has what it needs to free all Palestinians in Israel's jails, indicating that the militant group may try to use the Israelis it kidnapped as bargaining chips to secure the release of Palestinian prisoners. So soon after Hamas official Khaled Mashal made the remarks on the captives, who include Israelis and non-Israelis kidnapped by Hamas on October 7th, the group's armed wing separately said that the non-Israelis were guests and that they would be released when circumstances allow. So they're saying the non-Israelis, they're hostages that I guess are not Israeli citizens, will be released at some point. Who knows what the situation is with that, but the Israeli military says that Hamas has 199 hostages in Gaza. Hamas has said that it has between 200 and 250, and they've also claimed that 22 have been killed by Israeli airstrikes. So it's not clear what the exact number is of hostages that they have or hostages that have been killed. But that's a big thing. A big reason why Hamas took all these prisoners was because there's thousands of Palestinians in jail in Israel, and they want to use them to negotiate something. But it doesn't seem like Israel has any plans to negotiate anything. I know a few years ago, I think it was 2011, Hamas captured one Israeli soldier and traded him for a few hundred Palestinian captives, Palestinian prisoners. So, they've had success in the past, but again, just doesn't seem like there's any sign of negotiations happening right now. All right, the next one here, live updates on Gaza from Middle East Eye. So we just have their page up because it's just a good resource. They keep updating this. So the latest thing that they have, a Russian-backed UN resolution calling for a ceasefire fails. So Russia was trying to get the UN Security Council to endorse a ceasefire in Gaza, but that's been voted down. President Biden is going to visit Israel on Wednesday. 2,000 U.S. soldiers moved toward Israel. So the U.S. is sending a rapid response force made up of about 2,000 U.S. Marines and sailors to the coast of Israel. So I think this is separate from that other 2,000 troop force. I'll figure it out tomorrow. But this says that they will be on the USS Bataan, which is an amphibious assault ship. So more ships going to the region. U.S. evacuates nearly 1,000 citizens from Israel. So again, they just have a good resource over there if you want to get the latest updates on what's going on in Gaza. The last story here is the only non-Israel Gaza related thing that we have on the page. U.S. envoy makes a trip to Taiwan ahead of elections. And this is the U.S. de facto envoy because the U.S. does not have formal diplomatic relations with Taiwan. They have a de facto ambassador, essentially, who is the chair of the American Institute in Taiwan. But what's interesting is her name is Lauren Rosenberger, and she took this post about 7 months ago, and she was on the National Security Council on as a China advisor, and she's considered a pretty serious China hawk. So she is who is now representing the U.S. in Taiwan. And they discussed general things in this visit, but I really wanted to put this article up because it had some interesting things about the election. You have the Democratic Progressive Party, which is the ruling party that's in power, and they're more independent-minded. And then you have the Kuomintang, which has always been the main opposition party, who want better relations with Beijing. Then you have the Taiwan People's Party, who's actually polling better than the Kuomintang, and they're somewhere in the middle. So right now, polls show that the DPP, which is the ruling party, would win if it's a three-way vote. So this article mentions that the Kuomintang and the TPP are discussing forming a coalition. So if that happens, that could really change things. If a TPP and a Kuomintang coalition wins the election, which is in January, so it's coming up soon, I think it could really change Taiwan's relations with the U.S. and China. Right now, if the DPP wins, we're going to keep going in the direction that we're going, which is more U.S. support, more U.S. military aid, Taiwan moving as far away from China as it can. But that could change with this vote. The U.S. says that they haven't picked a side, but I think it's pretty clear who the U.S. would want to win here. But that is it for the news for today. Go check out our Viewpoints. We have one from Aaron Mate, The Roots of Israel's Ethnic Cleansing in Gaza. One from Ron Paul, Hamas's Victory. One from Benjamin Ablo, You're not allowed to say that NATO caused the war unless you are NATO's Secretary General. One from Ted Galen Carpenter, Credulous or dishonest journalists regurgitate pro-war propaganda. One from Rashid Khaldi, does the U.S. really want a mass expulsion in Gaza? But that is everything. You could always support the show by sharing it with your friends, subscribing, liking on YouTube, Rumble, Odyssey, wherever you watch. Follow us on social media. Tell your friends about antiwar.com. I'll be back tomorrow with some more news for you. Thanks for listening.